I'm Jill Meller. I'm currently president of the Institute, and as my day job, I'm the Legal and Governance Director of MTR Corporation here in Hong Kong. And I've worked with MTR and lived in Hong Kong for 17 years this year. So it is my home. I'm almost a Hong Kong Yan. And what are we here to talk about this evening? Well, what I'd like to share with you tonight is my thoughts on what we as the Institute are calling purposeful governance, a stakeholder responsive approach. And the reason that we've arranged this seminar is because some of you will hopefully already be aware that our corporate governance paper competition this year is on the theme of purposeful governance. And you may have seen on our website or received an email with details of this year's competition. But just to read out for you the synopsis, and then perhaps to explain, say, a little bit more about why I'm here tonight to share with you my views on this subject. So the synopsis for this year's competition reads as follows. For the last few decades, there's been a commonly held view that the purpose of a company is to make profits for its shareholders. However, there is now another school of thought, which is fast becoming mainstream, which is that for companies to be sustainable in the longer term, they need to create value for all of their stakeholders. But then a problem emerges, which is that there are so many stakeholders. Their interests could well be diverse, consistent, or at loggerheads with each other. How can a company pick and choose which stakeholder interests to consider? And how can a company seek to balance competing stakeholder interests? Might the answer lie in understanding the purpose of the company beyond profit, as delineated by its vision and mission and implemented by its strategy? Which brings us to the question of whether it is possible, or indeed necessary, to tie governance to a sense of purpose. And so I'm a passionate believer in purposeful governance, in the need for companies to take a broader approach than just focusing on the needs of shareholders. And so what I'll share with you tonight is my thinking as to why that is the case. I'll share with you a little bit as to what MTR is doing in this space and how we are trying to take account of our stakeholders' needs and trying to balance the different concerns and desires of stakeholders. And then I'll finally run through a few case studies of where companies have perhaps got it wrong, so that hopefully you'll have some material to take away and think about as you're preparing your submissions for the competition. We do have our usual Q&A feature available on the webinar tonight, and so please do put in your questions and towards the end of the session I will try and leave 5 or 10 minutes to answer some of those questions and maybe to start a little bit of a discussion going on some of the issues that we're talking about. So to move on, what do we mean by purpose? Well, if you read a dictionary, purpose is defined as the reason for which something is done or created, or for which something exists. And it seems like a pretty straightforward concept. If you consider a down jacket, what is the purpose of a down jacket? Well, it's fairly straightforward. The purpose is to keep you warm during the winter when the air conditioning is too cold. Think about a house, a flat. What's the purpose of a flat? It's clearly to provide you with shelter from the elements, to provide you with a home and with somewhere to live. But things do get a little bit more difficult when you get to the purpose of a company. Why do companies exist? Going back to that definition, why were they created? Well, back in it's now the 1970s, the commonly held view was that the social responsibility of a business was to increase its profits. And indeed, Milton Friedman went further than this and said that where a company tries to do more than that, so where a company tries to do social good, it's effectively trying to take the role of government. Where a company tries to reward its employees in a particular way, then again, it's performing different roles that a company's not really designed to perform. So his clear view was absolutely you had to act ethically and in line with legal and regulatory guidelines. But within that framework, the social responsibility of business was to increase its profits. And for shareholders, they would receive their dividends, and it was up to them to decide what to do with that money, whether to spend that to address social needs or whether to spend it on further investments or to further their own wishes and desires. But I think the world has moved on since then. And there's a quote here that's now a few years old from Richard Branson, who talks about the brands that will thrive in the coming years are the brands that have a purpose beyond profit. And this is all really about, I think, understanding why your company exists. Why was your company set up in the first place? Because profit, and I completely agree with this statement, in itself is not a purpose. It's simply a result of the business activities that you carry out. To have a purpose means that the things that you do as a company, the business activities that you carry out, are of real value to others. And those others, I think, are your core stakeholder groups. So take MTR. What is MTR's purpose? What's the reason for which MTR was created? And if you think back to the 1970s, when government first came up with the idea of building and operating a metro system in Hong Kong, I don't think anyone in government at that time was suggesting that the reason that we should create an MTR to develop this metro system was to create profits and to generate returns to go back to government and, after our listing, to our other shareholders. I think instead people were thinking about how difficult it was to travel around Hong Kong at that time. They were thinking about traffic congestion and how difficult it was to get across the harbour, and thinking therefore about what that meant for the development of Hong Kong as a city. And so they were thinking about how MTR could help address those societal and indeed environmental needs in Hong Kong, and to really get Hong Kong moving as a city, to enable people to easily move around the city. And so we have as a vision, and this has recently been restated after a strategy exercise that we carried out last year, our vision is to be an internationally recognised company that connects and grows communities with caring, innovative and sustainable services. And our purpose is, just as I think people thought back in the 1970s, to keep Hong Kong moving. And as we've expanded overseas, to keep those other cities in which we operate moving. And this is an incredibly powerful purpose statement for MTR, because during sometimes challenging times, so during the protests that we had in MTR back in 2019, we could focus our staff around ignoring the politics and just keeping their focus. Our job as a company was to keep Hong Kong moving. And that meant everybody in Hong Kong. And so this is a statement we've now adopted as our formal corporate purpose statement, and has been really helpful for us, because it enables us to think about, okay, if this is our corporate purpose, who are our key stakeholder groups? So clearly they are our shareholders. We have to be financially sustainable in order to keep operating. And as a listed company, we have to generate profits for our shareholders. Otherwise, we wouldn't continue to exist. But beyond that, we have a number of other important stakeholder groups. And we, as we manage MTR, as we make decisions in our business, we have to think about those stakeholder groups, think about their interests, and how we can try and meet their expectations, how we can balance those interests. And importantly, we need to think about what that means for our corporate governance framework. Because your corporate governance framework is all about your internal controls, all about the checks and balances that you have in place as a business to ensure that the right decisions are taken in the best interests of your stakeholder group, to ensure that your risks are managed. And if one group of your stakeholders has a particular concern that you as a company haven't taken into account when you're making a particular decision, then there's a big business risk there for you. So at MTR, we start with our purpose. We then think about our different stakeholders and the importance of engaging with them and understanding their concerns, their needs, what they would like MTR to do, so that we can make sure we take those different interests into account when we're making decisions. And so who are our stakeholders at MTR? Well, we have a pretty broad stakeholder group, because just about everyone in Hong Kong, I think, has an interest in MTR. So we clearly have our customers, the pre-COVID 5.86 million people or passenger journey trips every day. They are clearly a critically important stakeholder group for MTR as a public transport services provider. But we also have our employees. So we employ around 18,000 people here in Hong Kong and over 40,000 people around the world. Again, if we're not taking their interests into account, if we're not understanding what they care about and the values that they have and that they would expect their employer to have, then we're probably not making the right decisions. We also have our supply chain. So we have a huge supply chain here and globally to help us build our new railway lines, to help us operate and maintain the existing railway network. And again, if we're not thinking about them and making sure that their concerns are being taken into account, then companies in the supply chain could go bust, could go out of business and leave us with a gap in our supply chain. So again, I come back to the fact that taking into account the interests of your stakeholders is just good business. It's about managing your business risks and making sure you take the right things into account. We have, I think, at MTR, the community at large. Clearly, with our government ownership, with our public service obligation that we have, and with the reach that we have in the city, I think our obligations to think about stakeholders do go as far as thinking about the community. And finally, perhaps slightly more difficult to think of the environment as a stakeholder, but I do think it is an important environment because if we don't, an important stakeholder, because if we don't operate in a healthy environment, in a healthy society, it makes it much more difficult for us to be successful as a company. So how do we think about taking these different stakeholders' interests into account? Well, in terms of our customers, we think about the services that we provide to our customers. We try and make sure, for example, in the picture on the left of the screen here, that our facilities are accessible to all, whether people are abled or disabled. We've introduced through COVID buttons where you can just wave your hand in front of the button to call the lift, as opposed to having to touch the button. We've thought about, in terms of our customer service centres, how we go about providing advice and support to our customers. Is there advice that we can provide through the new MTR, relatively new MTR mobile app, or do people still have to go to the customer service centre? And so when we're planning new railway lines, when we're thinking about upgrading our existing railway lines, we always have the interests of our customers in mind. Similarly, we don't forget our employees, and this photo here is of some of my colleagues in London that work for the MTR Elizabeth line. And they won a couple of awards recently. One was for diversity and inclusion in their workforce, and the second was for the number of employees that they have put through apprenticeship schemes. So for those employees that have been through the apprenticeship schemes, if they are feeling rewarded in their jobs, if they're feeling like the company has supported them in terms of their ongoing career development, then they're more likely to be loyal to us as an employer, to speak well of us as an employer, to their friends, to their colleagues, to people in other companies in the industry. And again, that will bring benefits back to MTR. Likewise, focusing on diversity and inclusion, and one of the particular things Elizabeth Line has looked at is trying to recruit more women or more female train drivers. Often train driving is not seen as a particularly friendly profession for females, but actually given the shift working, it can be quite a good profession, because if females have other obligations in life, family obligations, sometimes the shift work can work around that. And so again, we're trying to meet the needs of us as a business in terms of recruiting the right people, but also to try and find solutions that work for our employees. And I think a focus on diversity and inclusion, on making sure all of your staff feel at home in the business and able to bring them best selves to work, again, is good for them, but it also makes business sense. In terms of our supply chain, we try and work with them to develop innovative solutions, which may provide both a business opportunity for them, but again, also address a business concern of ours. So during the time of COVID, we worked with some suppliers in the mainland to help co-develop our robots, which spray, and you can just see from the top of the photo there, chemicals around a train, or it could be around an office building where perhaps you've had somebody who's been diagnosed with COVID. And the beauty of these robots, obviously they operate by themselves. The person that's operating it can stand at a reasonable distance. And importantly, the chemicals get into those hard to reach areas within the train compartment so that we can be comfortable that the train has been properly sterilised before it goes back out into service. And this has given our supply chain an opportunity to develop a new product that potentially they can not only sell to us, but also to other third parties. So again, it's something that's creating value for our supply chain, but also value for MTR. Our communities, and this is a photo here of one of our stations that we operate in the Stockholm metro system. And if any of you have traveled to Sweden, when you are allowed to travel again, then it's often referred to as the world's longest art gallery, because they have these fantastic stations hewn out of the rock and with the artwork similar to what you can see on the photo here in the stations. But the bit of community focus I wanted to talk about in Stockholm was in relation to safety and security. And there are some areas of Stockholm where there have been real challenges around safety and security, where there's very high percentages of migrant populations. And there have been some challenges around people feeling safe to use the metro system. And so we've reached out into those communities. We've hired people from those communities. And we've worked with local community organisations and with the local police force to try and make sure that actually people feel that the station is a part of the community, that they want to keep the station safe and they want to keep the station open and running, and generate a sense of pride and belonging. So again, we can benefit because we can keep the train services running, but the community benefits because they can continue to access the railway and get to work or get to see their families, even when we've been living through these challenging times. So again, fantastic work there with the local communities. And we also like to think about, as I mentioned, the environment as a key stakeholder. And so in Hong Kong, this is a picture of the Mai Po marshes. And so when, and back in the KCRC days, the West Rail line was built, there was an obligation on KCR to re-provide some of these wetlands so that the wildlife and the biodiversity in that area would be preserved. And we still look after some of these wetlands today. So this is how we look at our different groups of stakeholders, and how in making decisions, we try and balance their interests, and we try and work out which are the most material interests, which are the most material issues for us as a business and for our stakeholders, and try and make sure those are the ones that we address. And so how is this relevant to corporate governance? Well, I'd go back to original concepts of corporate governance, and I talked about Milton Friedman's view of the purpose of a company simply being to generate profits. And there's a little bit of a view here, and this is from about 10 years ago now, that a definition of corporate governance was the collection of internal control mechanisms that an organization adopts to prevent or dissuade potentially self-interested managers from engaging in activities detrimental to the welfare of shareholders. And this did also talk about stakeholders. I tried to put a definition together a few years ago when I was doing a presentation for Open University, that corporate governance was about the checks and balances that a company puts in place in order to ensure that it is properly run in the interests of all of its stakeholders. A more recent quote from Deloitte's, that if not done already, companies should be defining and beginning to report on their purpose and how they're engaging with what Deloitte called their ecosystem of employees, customers, and suppliers, and should be reviewing their impact on society as a whole. And even more recently, from August 2019, Business Roundtable, which is a US organization of some of the largest corporations in America, talked about each of their stakeholders being essential and committing to deliver value to all of them for the future success of both the companies, the communities, and the country as a whole. So going back, and I'll skip back a couple of definitions to the one that I put forward, if we are as a company focusing on the success not only of the company, but also local communities, if we are thinking about the impact of our companies on society as a whole, then our corporate governance framework, the checks and balances that we put in place, the collection of internal control mechanisms that we adopt, needs to ensure that those different stakeholder interests are taken into account in the decision-making process and indeed in the risk management framework that we all have in place. I talked about the Business Roundtable statement on the purpose of a corporation, and I'll leave this on the screen just for a couple of minutes to allow you to read this, and I'll pick out a few of the points that really stood out to me. So in the center of the screen there, you can see the statement that while each of the individual companies that signed up to this statement has their own corporate purpose, that there was a collective sense that these companies shared a fundamental commitment to taking on board all of their different stakeholders. So they committed to delivering value to their customers, to investing in their employees, in compensating them fairly and providing important benefits to their employees, supporting them through training and education, supporting them in the development of skills for the current world, and fostering diversity, inclusion, dignity, and respect. They all committed to dealing fairly and ethically with the supply chain and being as good partners to the supply chain, both large and small. They all committed to supporting the communities in which they operated, to respecting the people in those communities and protecting the local environment. And they committed, of course, to generating long-term value for the shareholders who provide the capital that allow those companies to operate. And so I think they're really importantly, an understanding that each company has its own corporate purpose, but within that purpose, to understanding these different stakeholder groups and understanding what value that particular company with its own purpose can deliver to these different stakeholder groups. And really important for me there, and this goes to some of the legal theory that sits behind this in terms of what legally must directors take into account when they're making decisions. Are directors able legally to take into account the concerns of a broader stakeholder group, or do they have to just focus on shareholders? And if you look at the companies ordinance here in Hong Kong, similar legislation in the UK and the US, then the legislation is all slightly different. But my take on this is that if you are looking at the long term, that there is no conflict between taking shareholders' interests into account and taking the longer term interests of stakeholders' interests into account. Imagine, for example, you are focused more solely on shareholders and you're not thinking about investing in your employees. Potentially people start to leave the company. The community hears about the state of employment at your company and others don't want to join. So you can't find the resources you need to continue to deliver that value for your shareholders. Similarly, if you're not protecting the environment, if you're a company that has premises, it could be hospitality premises, it could be a factory in a part of the world that is very susceptible to climate change, then unless you are involved in trying to manage that local environment, those assets of yours could become stranded assets because that area could be covered by the sea if sea levels were to rise. And again, how do you then create value for your shareholders if you've lost your factory or you've lost some of your key assets? And if you're not thinking about delivering value to your customers, then generally they will go somewhere else. And so they will show by their feet, by their spending power, the fact that they don't think you're taking their concerns into account. So in the very short term, some of these things might not bear value, but my very strong view is that in the longer term, you can absolutely create shared value for your shareholders and your other stakeholder groups. And I think it's incredibly important to seek to do so. But it's not always easy. It's a difficult balancing act. And indeed, when I mentioned at the start, the synopsis for the corporate governance paper competition, we talked about the fact that there could be stakeholder interests which are in conflict with each other, or indeed at loggerheads with each other. So how as a company and how as a corporate governance professional working in that company, can you help your company to try and balance these different interests, to try and determine which are the most important, and how, if there is a conflict, you should seek to prioritize and try and reach the best decision? Well, I think the good news is that there are some frameworks that can help us with this. And it's clear that materiality matters. So the idea is that while you should take into account all of your different stakeholder groups, all of their interests will not be material, either to them as stakeholders or indeed to your own company. And there was a recent study by SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which showed that companies that seek to address their material, environmental and social and stakeholder issues and ignore those immaterial issues outperform both companies that seek to address material and immaterial issues and outperform companies that address neither by nearly 9%. So there's a good message here that you need to try and work out what are the material stakeholder, environmental, social issues for your company and focus on those. And how do you go about doing that? And it can be very confusing. You look at the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been around now for a few years and are the United Nations list of areas that need to be focused on in order for our globe to be sustainable. So when you look at these, you might think, gosh, where should my company start? For some companies, it may be relatively straightforward. If you are a university institution, for example, then perhaps quality education would jump out to you as an area that you should be focused on. And you should be thinking about, okay, that's a material issue. How does that then relate to my different stakeholder groups? And therefore, what considerations should we take in mind in making decisions? If you are a company, perhaps a beverage producer, then maybe clean water stands out to you as somewhere that you should focus, because water is such an important part of your supply chain that it's both a business need for you to make sure that you have a good, a clean, a stable water supply. And in focusing on that can also address a community need. If you are an electricity generation company, then maybe 7 is a key area for you to focus on: affordable and clean energy. But for lots of companies, it's not quite that straightforward. So for a company like MTR, you could argue that poverty is relevant. We want to make sure our services are affordable for everybody so that people can afford to travel on the MTR. You may say that, well, sustainable cities and communities is obviously very relevant to our core business, because we want to make sure that Hong Kong is sustainable as a city, and indeed the other cities in which we operate are also sustainable. But then we're also interested in number 9, which is industry and innovation and infrastructure, because we not only operate the rail systems, but we build new railway systems. And certainly we should be concerned about 8, because from our employees' perspective, we want to make sure we have the right working conditions in place. And so it's not always that straightforward. And so what do we do at MTR? Well, we try and have a kind of two-way matrix, which looks at, on the left-hand side, what do our stakeholders think about these issues? So if we were to go back to the Sustainable Development Goals, if we were to go out to the community, to our customers, to our employees, to our supply chain, and ask them which issues we should really focus on, they would all give us their views, and we could then plot those on this matrix. Just excuse me while I take a sip of water. Similarly, from an internal MTR perspective, we can look at how important those issues are to our business. And I just gave you some examples there of how we might look at those Sustainable Development Goals and work out the ones that are most relevant to our business from a risk and an opportunity perspective. And if we then plot these onto this chart, clearly the areas that we should focus on as being most material to MTR are the issues which are both important to our business and important to our stakeholders. So the ones that would be plotted on the top right-hand side of that chart. And so indeed, we've just gone through an exercise as part of our new corporate strategy of defining, as I touched on, our purpose and our corporate values, but then setting for ourselves refreshed what we are calling social objectives, so environmental and social focus areas for us, having gone through that exercise of what's important to our stakeholders and what is important to us as a business. And so our goal through this is to accelerate our social and environmental ambitions and to support the changing needs of both the society and the environment here in Hong Kong. And so we have chosen 3 focus areas going forward, and I'll briefly touch on these and why we think they're relevant both to us and to society. So the first area we've identified is social inclusion. Now, people are pretty familiar with the term diversity and inclusion, and people think of that often in the context of a workplace. So is your workforce diverse, and probably more importantly, does everyone in your workforce feel included? Do they all feel that they are a part of your company, that they're welcome at your company, and that they can bring their whole selves to work? But we think about social inclusion as being slightly broader than that. So we think about it in terms of accessibility to our network. So Are our stations accessible for the abled and the disabled? We think about it in terms of affordability. So are the fare concessions that we're offering, meaning that, again, everybody in the community can access the MTR? And we're thinking about it in terms of community more generally, and the overall sense of social inclusion in the Hong Kong community. And this, for us, it fits incredibly well with our business, because as a public transport operator, just about everyone in Hong Kong takes the MTR. So we carry CEOs and cleaners, we carry the old and the young, we carry the tourists and the locals, we carry the abled and the disabled. And so this concept of social inclusion, something that is very close to our heart and our core business, but also something that's very important for Hong Kong as a society. The second area we've chosen is our GHG emissions, or our carbon emissions, and a desire to reduce those. And we are currently going through an exercise to work out what we can commit to in terms of future targets. And this is, again, something that's very important to the Hong Kong community. You'll be aware that mainland China and the Hong Kong governments have set their own carbon neutral target dates, with the mainland, I think, being 2060 and the Hong Kong government being 2050. So there's a big driver for businesses in Hong Kong to decarbonise. And you may ask yourselves, well, surely as a low carbon public transport operator, you're already kind of environmentally friendly enough. And indeed, the large part of our carbon emissions does come from the electricity that we purchase to operate our network here in Hong Kong. But we recognise that that is not enough. We have to have our own carbon emission reduction journey. And so that's something that we're committing to as part of these new objectives. And the third area is what we're calling advancement and opportunities. So trying to be an enabler for social mobility by creating opportunities for the community. And again, very important part for Hong Kong, given the challenges that we have around social and economic inequality in Hong Kong. And also a good tie with our core business, because as we build and operate new railway lines, we create opportunities for people to join MTR as employees. We create opportunities for our supply chain, for working with small and medium-sized enterprises as our suppliers. And indeed, we create opportunities perhaps for research and development, for innovation with local universities and the local startup and innovation ecosystem. So recognizing that as we grow as a company, we create opportunities for the community, and seeking to bring those two things, so the community interest and MTR's interest, together, and see therefore what we can deliver in that space. So the challenge for us now and our next steps on this is what do we do within each of these key headings? And so we're going through a process now of breaking these down under the 3 headings, having 10 commitment areas, and then with each of those 10 areas identifying individual initiatives that we can roll out. And hopefully, watch this space, you'll hear some more from us in the next few months in this area. But how might you go about it at your company, in your business, in your role as a governance professional? How do you work out what are those stakeholder concerns? What do our stakeholders think of us? How do you then map out what's material for you in terms of importance to your business and importance to your stakeholders? Well, a couple of points I would make here. Firstly, I think communication is critical. So a good way to find out what your shareholders, what your stakeholders think of you, is to go out and talk to them. So you probably have an investor relations function within your business who will have regular communication with your shareholders and your large institutional investors. Through AGMs, your small retail investors will raise their concerns. So there are probably channels already in place where you can find out what your investment community thinks of you. Maybe you have a corporate affairs team who has regular communication with politicians, commentators, NGOs perhaps you engage with. So do you have a structured stakeholder engagement process in place where you can identify who your key stakeholders are and who within your company is responsible for going to talk to them? Do you then have a methodology for mapping your stakeholder concerns onto a map, so you just understand who those stakeholders are and what issues are important to them, and then you can cross-check those against areas that are important for your business? Do you have a way of ensuring that employee concerns are aired at a board or an executive level? So hopefully you might have in place a whistleblowing procedure which would allow employees to raise their concerns, but hopefully you would hear about those concerns way before they're raised through the whistleblowing channel. So what systems do you have in place as a company to give employees an opportunity to speak up and to tell you what they are thinking about? I'll switch now to the left-hand side of this slide and just talk about a few common stakeholder concerns that were certainly around before COVID-19, and I'd suggest have perhaps had a magnifying glass put on them because of COVID-19. So I think stakeholders generally, and this can be investors, it could be the community, it could be your employees, are concerned about climate change and pollution. And we recently had one of our largest active shareholders asking our CEO and our finance director directly about MTR's carbon emissions and about our plans to reduce those emissions. This is absolutely something that is on the radar of lots of different stakeholder groups. There has been a concern, not so much in Hong Kong, but certainly in other jurisdictions around the world, about the perception of high executive pay. So again, when companies are thinking about how their resources are used, thinking about that, the pay gap perhaps between the executives and the average pay in the corporation, maybe thinking about the gender pay gap in the corporation and understanding what different stakeholders think about that issue. Certainly, there have been concerns around corporate tax planning, and I often use an example in this space when I'm talking about how to try and balance different stakeholder needs. So Starbucks a few years ago were criticised quite publicly for their tax planning. And as a company, historically, I think it was the right thing to do for a company to think about how did it pay as little tax as legally possible. So I'm not talking here about illegal tax avoidance schemes, but if you could try and legally pay as little tax as possible, that was generally considered to be the right thing to do because it meant you generated more profits and those profits could be distributed to your shareholders. But I think in recent years, and some of you may have been following the discussions at the G7 summit in the UK around the large tech companies and trying to decide where should they be paying profits. Should it be where they are domiciled as a company, which could be a low tax jurisdiction, or could it be where they actually carry out their corporate activities? And in the Starbucks case, they were very heavily criticised on social media and in the public for these very legal tax evasion schemes, or tax avoidance schemes, I should say. The evasion ones are normally the non-legal ones, so the tax avoidance schemes. It wasn't entirely fair that they were criticised because what that criticism failed to take into account was actually the contribution that Starbucks made to lots of local communities. So in a lot of places around the world, Starbucks has rejuvenated high streets. Often they employ lots of local people who will themselves pay taxes, so they're generating employment. And indeed, they're providing opportunities for local suppliers to work with them and to develop their businesses. But all of a sudden, overnight, there was this shift in perception from Starbucks having done something that was the right thing to do because it minimized their tax, it increased their profits, to somebody saying, well, hang on a minute, that's perhaps not the right thing for the company to have done. The company should have thought about the appropriate amount of tax for them to be paying. And so I think this question of corporate tax planning has been in the spotlight over the last few years. Rising inequality is one that certainly is an issue here in Hong Kong, where we have one of the largest Gini coefficients in the world. And indeed, the impacts of social inequality are far-reaching in terms of issues like crime, in terms of things like teenage pregnancies, in terms of mental health of a society. And so the sense, I think, from stakeholders is that companies have to play their role in trying to address some of these issues around rising inequality. And certainly, I think during COVID, these issues have really been even more magnified or spotlighted. So concerns around low or no wage growth have been exacerbated. I think issues of inequality have only been further highlighted because of COVID. And certainly climate change has been brought to the fore when we've seen these fantastic clear days in Hong Kong, given how little people are traveling at the moment and the impact it's had on the economy. So I think lots of ways for you to find out what your stakeholders are thinking. Some of these very common concerns certainly will exist, but importantly, on the right-hand side of the slide there, thinking about a stakeholder engagement process within your business so that you can map your stakeholders, you can map the particular concerns that they've got, and then you can link those, say, to the issues that are material to your business. And importantly, down the bottom there, communication is critical, not only in terms of you talking to your stakeholders about what they're interested in and what their concerns are, but then you reporting back to your stakeholders and more generally how you have reached business decisions. Because inevitably your business decisions won't be able to meet the concerns, the interests of all of your stakeholders. You're not going to be able to keep them happy all the time. So how do you go back to them and tell them, look, we heard you, this is how we took your concern into account, and this is how within the constraints of our business we've tried to address that concern. It may be not what you wanted us to do in an ideal world, but this is what we were able to do, and we'd like to continue having that conversation with you. So I think now when corporate decisions such as tax planning are under the spotlight, that question or that issue of two-way communication, hearing from your stakeholders, telling them how you've made your decisions, is incredibly important. And I'll touch now on a few case studies, and I'm not necessarily going to come to a resolution in each of these case studies because they're not all easy. But the idea for sharing them with you is simply just to illustrate that challenge of the balancing act that companies and that we as governance professionals have to try and help our companies make those well-informed, those right decisions that have taken into account broader stakeholder interests. So Cathay Pacific is struggling financially. We know this, and it's been well reported. There's some figures up there about the amount of cash that Cathay has been burning on a monthly basis. There was a rescue rights issue, and the Hong Kong government contributed funds to Cathay to an amount of around $27 billion. And 2 government observers have been appointed to the board of Cathay. There have been material job losses announced. The Cathay Dragon brand has been closed down. And indeed, there's further talk about changes to terms and conditions of staff. So if you were sitting on the Cathay Pacific board of directors, if you were the company secretary of Cathay and you were advising that board of directors what issues they should take into account when making decisions, to who are those directors responsible? Clearly, they have responsibility to their shareholders, they have responsibility to their creditors, but they also have responsibilities, and government is now an advisor, to their employees. So how does Cathay try and balance all of those different interests when it makes decisions? A second example was the government support that both the Hong Kong government and a lot of other governments around the world have been providing during COVID. So in Hong Kong, we had the ESS, the Employee Support Scheme, which provided a certain amount of funding to employers if they would guarantee not to make any redundancies over a certain period of time. So if you're a board of directors of a company here in Hong Kong, if you are the company secretary advising that board of directors, what's the right thing to do? Should you apply for that government support or not? Well, you might say, if you're taking into account the interests of shareholders, of course you should. This is free money. It's money that's just available to you from the government, provided you can make the commitments that you had to around your workforce. And so a little bit like with tax planning, if you're just thinking about your shareholders, maybe this is a no-brainer. However, what if you are a company, perhaps a supermarket, an online retailer, who's actually benefited from COVID-19 in terms of the fact that your business has made more money during COVID-19? So if you are Zoom as a company that went from being relatively unknown and pretty small to the company that it is today, is it right that you apply for funds from government to support you because actually your business is doing incredibly well? Or is it the right thing to do to leave those funds with government to support other businesses, hospitality, travel, who've really struggled during COVID? Similarly, what might your employees think? Because the condition, as I mentioned, of the Hong Kong scheme was that you guaranteed not to make any redundancies during the period that you were receiving the government support. So perhaps you might think, okay, if we apply for the government support, this will send a really clear message to our employees that their jobs are secure. And so maybe that is the right thing to do. Now, the situation will be different for every company because every company will have a different group of stakeholders, and those stakeholders will have different concerns. But I just use it again by way of illustrating how challenging it can be sometimes for companies to balance these different interests and to make the right decisions. Some more examples on the slide here. EasyJet, which is a low-cost airline in the UK, paid out a relatively large dividend and then went to the UK government and asked for support. In the US, some companies have announced that they won't be paying all staff sick pay. Again, is that the right thing for them to do? And in the UK, again, elite and relatively wealthy football clubs have actually been using the furlough schemes or the ESS type schemes. How is that going to be perceived by their stakeholders? Will their stakeholders have seen that as the right thing to do? And a third example, which some of you may be familiar with, was a case in Australia involving Rio Tinto, the mining company. And as part of a new project that Rio Tinto was involved in, they blasted a gorge site, which was a 46,000-year-old Aboriginal heritage site in Western Australia. And this led to a large degree of public condemnation, of backlash from investors, and a parliamentary inquiry, and ultimately it led to resignations and a board-led investigation into the company. And you can see there at the bottom right-hand side the protests that this led to. So that failure to take into account the interests of some of their stakeholders, the interests in particular in this case of the local community, actually was very negative for the company from the perspective of lots of stakeholder groups, and almost certainly financially, because there are costs associated with going through a parliamentary inquiry. There are costs associated with investors perhaps threatening to pull out money from their business. There are certainly costs involved with carrying out a board-led investigation, and costs involved obviously in senior employees losing their jobs. So an example of perhaps where a company didn't take stakeholder considerations into account and indeed had to pay the price. So what does this mean for all of us as governance professionals? Well, I've got a great picture here of a roller coaster with us all feeling slightly like our world might be being turned upside down. But I've got a few pointers on the next slide as to what it might mean for us. And just before I move to those, just a quick reminder, if anyone does have questions that they would like me to address, then please type them into the Q&A box, and I'll try and leave a little bit of time at the end of the session to respond to those questions. So what does it mean for us as governance professionals? Well, I think it means a need to understand our purpose as an organisation. And I've used the word organisation here rather than company, because I think corporate governance and the need to understand our purpose is also important whether you work for an NGO or if you work for an organisation such as a university or an academic institution. I think for me, understanding your corporate purpose is the very first thing that you can do. And going back to what I touched on right at the beginning of this presentation, why do you exist as an organisation? Why were you created in the first place? What was the idea that somebody had behind you as an organisation? I think critically important. Once you understand your purpose, then the need to identify your stakeholders. And I've touched on earlier today the common groups of stakeholders that you would probably want to take into account. So certainly your shareholders, your employees, your supply chain, your customers, the broader community, and the environment. I would say a pretty good 6 places to start. So identify within those 6 areas who are your key constituent stakeholders, and setting in place a formal process to engage with those stakeholders, to understand their concerns and to map those so that you can take those into account as a company. And those stakeholder concerns will be put under that framework of your corporate purpose. As I showed you earlier with MTR, with our purpose of keeping Hong Kong, keeping cities moving, And then within that context, understanding our stakeholders and their different concerns. I think it's important for us to understand the need of striking a balance when we're making decisions. And this isn't, as I've touched on earlier, easy. And it's not easy because there are a lot of different stakeholders to take into account. And indeed, our stakeholders' views may change pretty quickly. And with things like social media, it's actually very easy for those views to change overnight. I use the example of Starbucks, where a tax avoidance scheme might have been seen as the right thing to do one day, and all of a sudden the next day could be seen as a bad thing to do. It's also complex because it's not only the views of your stakeholders that will change, but also your own business will be changing. So you might be operating in different countries. You might be operating in different areas of business, and that may bring with it a need to look at things slightly differently and to balance things slightly differently. And indeed, the regulatory and legal environment is also changing. So new legislation may be coming in the different places within which you do business. And so the challenge for us as advisors to the company and advisors to the board is to help our company, to help the board determine what is the right thing to do in that turbulent and changing world where your business is changing, where the legal and regulatory environment is changing, and indeed where the views and concerns of your stakeholders can also be changing. And I think what it means is a need to move from, and I'm just opening up the Q&A box so I can get a quick sight of what's coming up, the need for a focus not only on compliance, but also on the right thing to do. So absolutely, as a company, we should be legal and regulatory compliant, but I'm no longer sure that that is enough. And again, I might touch on the tax example there, where you might pay as much tax as you are legally obliged to, but would that be seen by companies as the right thing to do? And so I think it's that shift from narrow concerns to broader stakeholder concerns. And there's a need then for your corporate governance framework, your internal control and your risk management framework to have what I call both hard and soft controls. So hard controls being your policies, your procedures, your risk management framework, but also has soft controls in it in terms of looking at things like your culture, your values, your ethics as a company. And there's an example on a slightly later slide of Wells Fargo, which was a few years ago in the news because the way in which they remunerated their staff drove their staff to set up lots of fake customer accounts to try and there was an over focus on cross-selling between different customers. And so this was suddenly exposed and obviously thought of as being a bad thing. And you ask yourself, perhaps when all of those accounts were being set up, people were following the internal controls, the internal processes and policies and procedures, but there was obviously something within the culture of the company that a lot of people knew that this was happening, but it wasn't getting reported up to the right level. Nobody was putting up their hand and saying, this isn't the right thing for us to do as a business. And so I think increasingly, as the environment gets more complex, you need the hard controls, but you also need to recognize the importance of culture, values, and of ethics, so that when people feel something isn't right, they will speak up. Another great example of that, and you might think, what does this have to do with corporate governance, is Harvey Weinstein. And you all will know Harvey Weinstein, you all know the Me Too movement, and you also will have read about the stories of what's alleged to have happened within that business. Again, it's impossible that the majority of people working for that company didn't know what was going on. And yet nobody was speaking up. Nobody was saying that this was wrong. Indeed, the company was signing NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, with people that made claim against the companies to try and sort of get those issues to go away. So how do you make sure you have the right open culture within your business for people to speak up where they see things that there are the wrong things that are being done? And we also, no matter how good our corporate governance framework, we need to be agile, because there will still be things that will hit us out of the blue, so-called black swan events. And so we need to be prepared through a good crisis management framework to deal with and to respond to those black swan events. as agilely as possible. And so we need to be better at adaptation and at resilience. So it's a shift for me from compliance to doing the right thing. And that should be the question, I think, that we ask ourselves when we are asked for advice. So it's not only saying to the board of directors or to the management team, yes, this is legally from a regulatory perspective, it doesn't convene the SFO, the listing rules, if you're a listed company, the company's ordinance. It's really putting ourselves in the shoes of our different stakeholders and saying, how is this going to be seen? I often talk about the front page test. So if a decision that we're about to take were to be put onto the front page of the SCMP tomorrow, how would we feel about that? How would it be perceived? And as I mentioned before, I think it's about getting a combination right of the hard controls, the systems, the processes, the procedures, but importantly also getting the corporate culture right. So thinking about your values as a company, thinking about your culture as a company, your ethics and your integrity, and thinking about how that aligns with your corporate strategy and with your purpose. So good corporate governance is very difficult to describe, but bad corporate governance is very obvious. And often when it happens, and I talked about the Rio Tinto example earlier, it's very easy to suddenly say, well, how on earth was that allowed to happen within that company? How could they have allowed things to go wrong in that way? And one of the earliest examples of this was back in the Enron days, where there were accounting scandals within Enron. And again, you look at it now and say, how did the audit committee not ask the right questions? But it keeps happening. So an older Rio Tinto case here that involved bribery allegations. GlaxoSmithKline being fined in China in terms of, I think this was bribing doctors to buy GlaxoSmithKline drugs over other drugs. Again, a real focus within their culture on sales, perhaps over issues like integrity and were they doing the right thing. We've seen it in the banking industry with 5 of the world's biggest banks being hit with a bill of over 5 billion and criminal charges over allegations around the rigging of currency markets. Wells Fargo, I talked about 5.3 million workers, 5,300 workers fired for creating fake accounts. Issues in Samsung a few years ago. Carillion in the UK, a company that collapsed, again, questions over the way its accounts were being put together, and a huge public taxpayers bill there to try and rescue some of that business because it supported a lot of public contracts. Harvey Weinstein, I've touched on. Facebook again, and the tech giants have been in the news again this week in relation to tax. So I think if you ask yourselves, or people in your company ask you, why is this broader, purposeful, stakeholder-led governance approach important, then you can illustrate to them with examples of where companies have got it wrong and just what the cost to those companies have been. So thank you. With that, that covers my slides.